My name is Eric Suffridge. I am the National Resources Inventory Grazing Land Program Leader for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I am based in Ames, Iowa, on the campus of the Iowa State University. In the presentations to follow, you're going to hear a lot about NRI grazing land data. However, in order to better understand today's National Resources Inventory, it is important, I think, to understand the journey on how we got here. There we go. So beginning in the 1920s, the soil erosion threats on American farmland began to draw scrutiny. Eyewitness accounts, research, and keen observations by scientists led to extensive written documentation that there was rapidly developing threat to the nation's agriculture industry. Much of this effort culminated in a 1928 publication by Hugh Hammond Bennett and W.R. Chapline that was titled Soil Erosion, a National Menace. Shortly thereafter, in 1933, the Soil Erosion Service came into being, and it was an agency that was created in the Department of Interior. Okay, looks like I got muted. So the SES, the Soil Erosion Service, was to be led by Hugh Hammond Bennett at that time. So in 1934, the Soil Erosion Service completed the National Erosion Reconnaissance Survey in an effort to document the extent and effect of soil erosion on productivity. This was the first well-documented nationwide natural resources inventory of any kind ever conducted. It took place on 1.9 billion acres of public and private land, with soil erosion as the sole focus. The results of this study, along with other ongoing issues, served as the basis for Public Law 74-46, which was the Soil Conservation Act, which, among other things, established the Soil Conservation Service as an agency within the Department of Agriculture in 1935. Hugh Hammond Bennett was tapped to be the agency's first chief. During the next 3 decades, the Soil Conservation Service undertook additional natural resource inventories, and each of these was known as a Conservation Needs Inventory. These took place in 1945, 1958, and 1967. The 1945 inventory was designed to support program development and to set conservation priorities. This inventory established support for the SES to undertake natural resource inventories in-house rather than to solely rely on external sources. And of course, the agency has always partnered with other organizations such as the Agricultural Research Service, Bureau of Land Management, and U.S. Geological Survey. The 1958 CNI sought to estimate the magnitude and urgency of conservation measures that were needed in order to maintain agricultural productivity. An important outcome from the 1958 inventory was the determination of a need for sample plots from which data would be collected in the future. These were known as primary sampling units, and they were the first use of statistical sampling methods, and they were developed at Iowa State and Cornell. These studies were performed on 2% of non-federal land. The 1967 CNI was used to update information from the 1958 inventory, and it established sample points within each of the PSUs. So with passage of the Rural Development Act of 1972, the Soil Conservation Service was directed in Section 302 of that act to put in place a land inventory to study natural resource issues. The agency was tasked with releasing a report at not less than 5 years on the condition of the nation's soil, water, and related natural resources. And in 1975, as the agency was transitioning from the old inventory model, the Conservation Needs Inventory, to a new inventory process as dictated by that 1972 Act, the agency also undertook a potential cropland study. As the name implies, the objective of this study was to identify land that could potentially be converted to cropland. The study was used a subset of 1967 PSUs in order to look for land use changes that had occurred between 1968 and 1975. The primary outcome of this study was the highlighting of concerns over the nation's agricultural production capacity. From 1977 to 1997, the Soil Conservation Service, which became the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, in 1994, completed 5 inventories under the requirements of the Rural Development Act of 1972. These inventories were called the National Resources Inventory, or NRI, and they were completed every 5 years as required by the Act. The 1977 NRI included 70,000 primary sampling units and 195,000 sample points. The 1982 NRI expanded the number of PSUs and the sample points and had an initial goal of providing county-level resource data. Unfortunately, insufficient funding made that a goal that was not possible to be met. Another update occurred in 1987, and for the first time ever, remote sensing efforts were included in one of the inventories, and aerial photography was used on approximately 30% of the sample points. Computers were also used to compile the data collected by the field data collectors on hand on worksheets that they had used. The 1992 NRI update included more use of aerial photography along with the completion of missing data from 1982 and 1987 through the use of aerial photographs from those previous years. So in 1992, they actually went back and used some of those old photos and filled in some of the gaps in the data. And in 1997, the final five-year NRI data collection was completed. During this NRI, handheld devices replaced paper data collection forms. Data was uploaded through the internet. No field visits occurred unless aerial photography was lacking or of poor quality. So throughout the 90s, in addition to the general NRIs that had occurred every year, NRCS, SCS, and then NRCS undertook 6 special studies. These studies can best be described as intermediate snapshots of the status and condition of natural resources. These were taken apart from the regular NRI. The 1991 wetland survey focused solely on wetlands in relation to observations during the regular NRI efforts of 1982 and 1987. The 1995 erosion update study looked at soil erosion and conservation reserve program success as a result of the 1985 Farm Bill and where more efforts might be needed to address soil erosion. The 96 special study expanded on the 95 study to include more states, counties, and PSUs. The 97 to 98 studies repeated and did the same thing. They continued to expand upon the number of counties and states and PSUs that were included. The 99 special study changed focus a little bit and looked at the comparison between the universal soil loss equation and the revised universal soil loss equation. Collected data for carbon sequestration models and examined technologies and protocols for a continuous NRI process. And that continuous NRI process is going to be important as we move forward here. Internal discussions beginning as far back as the late 80s and continued in the mid-90s resulted in a decision in 1998 to move to an annual NRI data collection process. This annual NRI began in 2000, and the original plan was to sample 80,000 PSUs every year, with 45,000 coming from a core sample that are reviewed every year, and 35,000 from a rotational sample. And again, these were all to be remotely sensed. Objectives for the annual NRI collection were to produce the long-term trend information and to spread out the workload as opposed to just doing a larger effort every 5 years. And then it also allowed for the potential to undertake special inventories. And again, this annual and special inventory is going to be important for what we're talking about here in the presentations to follow. So shortly thereafter, one such special inventory arose for collection, and this was rangelands. While rangelands were not a new issue to NRCS, there were concerns about the lack of data and on the status and condition of the nation's rangelands. As such, prior to 2003, NRCS undertook several pilot studies to test the feasibility for conducting an annual NRI range study. The annual range study began in 2003 and included a small subsample of the larger NRI PSU segments in the sample points. Protocols were developed and remain largely unchanged for consistency, given that this is a long-term study. And then in 2013, pasture land was added to the study, and it became known as a grazing land study. Recent internal outcomes from these studies include such things as the 2018 Rangeland Resource Assessment and the 2018 Pasture Land Resource Assessment. The 2018 Rangeland Assessment utilized data that was collected from 2004 to 2005 with groupings of 2004 to 2010, 2011 to 2015 for trend analysis. And then the 2018 Pasture Land Assessment utilized data collected from 2013 at the beginning of the Pasture Land Assessment through 2016. And of course, this is just what we've done or what has been done internally. The external data usage far exceeds what has been described here, and you're going to hear about some of those projects later on in this forum and other presentations.